We all know that Kenner got the rights to the Star Wars toys after all the other toy companies turned them down. But that's not really the true story. One smaller toy company almost got the rights, if it wasn't for Silly Putty. Frank Gilligan was born in Del Reno, Texas in 1927 to Sherry and Philip Gilligan, ranchers who made a huge fortune near the end of the 1800s thanks to the oil market. When Frank grew up, he found he never got over his love for toys. What back then was mostly metal and wind-up toys. Frank's father pursued him to follow in the family oil business, but Frank had other dreams. He knew kids needed more than just boring metal toys that would only entertain kids for a few minutes. In 1938, when the family got their first television set, Frank was sent to do extra chores all alone in the oil tanker after he told his father that one day kids all over the world would be playing games on a television, not just watching things on it. His parents had enough of his outrageous claims. In 1943, Frank was about to head to college when Uncle Sam called in for his services, and he was sent to the battle line in France to help fight World War II. As always, Frank was a dreamer, and when his platoon got captured in occupied France, Frank would take old pieces of wood from nearby trees, carve small shapes into them, and invented a game for his buddies to keep them entertained and mind off being in a prisoner camp. After leaving the war in 1945, Frank moved back to his family's oil field. While working closely with his family, Frank noticed a strange rubber-like liquid coming from one of the oil drills. Scraping off the piece, he noticed it was gum-like, and he could twist it, pull it, even break it, put it back together, and bounce it off the ground. Frank couldn't stop playing with it, and he knew if he couldn't stop playing with it, kids would never stop playing with it. He took the rubber-like fun to his friend, an old army buddy inventor, who patented the rubber toy, called it Silly Putty, and got Frank to sell them in a plastic egg container during ad reads on the children's television show, The Howdy Doody Show. Silly Putty was a huge hit, and kids loved it. Well, all but one kid. Over in California, George Walton got it stuck in his sister's hair, and as punishment, he was ordered by his father to chew on Silly Putty for 13 hours. From that day on, the more he heard about Silly Putty, the more he hated it. Frank was raking in millions and seeing his dreams of becoming a toy maker come true. Selling the rights to Silly Putty, he used that money in 1965 to start his own toy company called Frank's Big Little Fun Toy. Frank and his staff went to work on the next big thing, but they found that a lot harder than they thought they would. In the first year, they released Water Ball, a ball made of water that failed to make a profit. Then they took a page from their Silly Putty days and came up with Play Sap, a cross between Silly Putty and bubblegum. Kids reported getting severe diarrhea from chewing it, and it was recalled within 6 months. In 1970, the company would release toy guns aimed for kids around the age of 10 that made realistic sounds. However, due to Frank's anti-gun stance, he demanded that all the toy guns be painted pink. Little boys stayed away. In 1974, after seeing the success Amigo was having with its Planet of the Apes toy line, Frank got the rights to make toys based on the Apple Dumpling Gang, a comedy film starring Don Knotts and Tim Conway. With a release date of 1975, Frank wasted no time. Taking out a $4.5 million loan, Frank started working on a Western playset town, toy horses, and action figures based on the characters. All seemed to be going right. Then, in early 1975, when orders for the toys had already been placed by major toy retailers, actor Don Knotts and Tim Conway refused to allow their likenesses to be used for the toys. Both actors want nothing to do with the toy line and fear that having a toy line based on the film would risk their chances of the film being taken seriously, and they would both be overlooked at Oscar season. The studio agreed and pulled out, leaving Frank and his company with a $4 million debt, toy orders that needed to be placed, and no production. The toy company filed bankruptcy in summer of 1975, stating that the investment into the Apple Dumpling Game as the reason. The company kept pushing forward, releasing other toys that made no real impact on the toy market. Frank's dream of becoming a force in the toy market was turning into a nightmare, and he knew it was about time to cut his losses and head back to the oil fields of Texas. That was until he ran into Alan Ladd Jr., then president of 20th Century Fox, at a party at a friend's house. Alan knew of the issues with the Apple Dumpling Gang and always felt that Frank was done wrong. He handed Frank a business card, with a phone number on it, saying, "I'm working with this guy that did American Graffiti. He has something I think that you would like to see." The last thing that Frank wanted to do was to risk working with another movie studio, but he had no real choice. This was the last chance to turn around the company. The next morning, Frank called the number and made an appointment to meet with George Lucas, who was in the middle of filming Star Wars and was back in Los Angeles for a few days. Other than knowing that it was a science fiction movie and had a lot of aliens and spaceships, Frank really didn't have much to go on, but knew he had to pitch something. He met with Lucas, who seemed upset, stressed out, and ill. He knew he had to act fast. Lucas wasn't really in the mood for a long, drawn-out meeting. He told Lucas he had a crazy plan to make small action figures, less than 1 inch tall, and ships to go alongside them. Lucas looked at some of the drawings and said, "How about 2 inches?" Frank wasn't about to disagree and said that could be done, but the ships would have to be a little bigger. Lucas put out his hand, said it was a deal, and asked when toys could be ready, as the movie was planned for a release of December 1976. Frank knew that would be a hard target to meet, but he promised he could have at least 5 toys ready by December. Lucas was excited, but he had never heard of the toy company Frank's Big Little Toy, and before leaving the room, he asked what made the toy company successful. Frank rattled off some toys from the last few years. Lucas never heard of one of them. So he asked Frank, "What's your toy to fame? What toy was it that sold so good it got you to where you are today?" With pride, Frank told George Lucas, "Silly Putty." Lucas stood there in the doorway as memories of him as a little George Walton Lucas Jr. being punished, chewing Silly Putty, flooded back into his memory. "We have no deal," Lucas said, and stormed out of the room. Frank was heartbroken, and he really didn't understand what had happened, as Lucas would never return any of his phone calls. When it was announced that Kenner had gotten the rights for Star Wars, Frank's Big Little Toy Company had already gone, closed down, and Frank was back in Texas, trying to sell out a dried-out oil field worth nothing. As Star Wars blew up, as Kenner grew to become a large toy company, Frank fell into depression, and by May 1979, suffered a massive stroke and passed away at the age of 51. And at the time he was broke and living with his cousin Walter. It makes you wonder what would have happened if Star Wars figures were made not by Kenner, but made by Frank's Little Big Toy. Although in the last few years Frank was in Great Depression, it wasn't losing Star Wars that was Frank's biggest regret. It was that his World War II buddy, Neil Uno Johnson, took Frank's wood carving game that he used to entertain the troops while in a prisoner camp, marketed it, and it became a huge hit that kids still play today, called Uno. And that's the story of how a small, almost unknown toy company almost got the rights to Star Wars if it wasn't for Silly Putty.
Junkman. Thank you, sir, for that unsolicited testimony.